thank you for joining us this afternoon. I was asked by the Contemporary Issue Committee to talk a little bit about navigating personal change and also how, as an individual, do you navigate organizational transition. So we will do that today. A little bit about myself. I'm currently serving as the Interim Director of Residential Life at Northwestern University. I've worked at many other institutions, and in the past three locations I've been, we've undergone significant organizational change. This led to this being a personal interest of mine, and I am 1 2-hour final away from a master's degree here at Northwestern in learning and organizational change. So I'm very passionate about the topic. I realize that we don't always touch on this in our graduate program, so it was a really neat opportunity for me to go back, and it's been my hobby over the past 4 years to learn more about change, and I hope to share some of that information with you today. So some of my goals for today, there are numerous theories around individual behavior change. Many are not research-based, and many are personalized by people who serve as executive coaches. So my goal today is to introduce you to models and concepts that will hopefully spark thoughts on how you might approach individual change in your life. A secondary goal is to talk through how individuals experience organizational change that's occurring around them and how you as a leader might help people through that change. As we think about change, it's helpful to consider 3 concepts related to individuals and how we might approach change. The first is the idea of mental models by Peter Senge. This is the lens through which we make distinctions, recognize systems, recognize relationships, and recognize perspectives. These are shaped by our own skills, experiences, perspectives on life, and our worldview. And our mental models really show how we interpret the world. One of the things we'll talk about through this webinar is how do we change our mental models. Oftentimes we need to shift our paradigm in order to see things in a different way or make the change that we're looking for. The second thing is called the ladder of inference, and this is from Chris Argis and Peter Senge from their book, The Fifth Discipline. This is an idea of how we process information and typically make decisions. The website mindtools.com explains this process well. The ladder of inference describes the thinking process that we go through, usually without realizing it, to get from a fact to a decision or action. The thinking stages can be seen as rungs of the ladder and are shown in the image. So starting at the bottom of the ladder, we typically have our reality and facts. From there, we experience these selectively based on our beliefs and our prior experience and the mental models that we have. At that point, we interpret what they mean. We apply our existing assumptions, sometimes without considering them. And we draw conclusions based on the interpreted facts and our assumptions. We develop beliefs based on these conclusions, and we feel like our actions are right because they're based on what we believe. But this can create a vicious cycle. Our beliefs have a big effect on how we select what we're observing, and they may lead us to ignore true facts altogether. Soon we're literally jumping to conclusions by missing facts and skipping steps in the reasoning process. By using the ladder of inference, we can think through what we're seeing and how we interpret that better. There's a YouTube video that's really interesting if you search ladder of inference, and it's 6 minutes long, so I didn't show it, but it's a cartoon. And it explains ladder of inference. It shows a person driving through a parking lot, and they're about to pull into a parking space when another car zooms ahead of them. Based on the observable data, the person in the car sees this and assumes that the person who pulled in the space saw him and intentionally took the space from him. He might also conclude that person is selfish and thinks he's more important than the other. After that person who stole the space gets out of the car, he comes over to the driver and apologizes because he just got a call from his wife in the store that she's about to go into labor. So this kind of shows how we might make assumptions based on what we see and how we observe the world. So how do we prevent ourselves from running up the ladder of inference? Some of those things to consider is questioning assumptions and conclusions. Sometimes we don't always consider what else is going on. What data did I select to see? What data did I not select? What else might be going on that I didn't consider at all? And then another way to avoid the ladder of inference is by seeking contrary data. So this is something that we'll talk about. This will relate to what we're talking about later as we think through how we learn and how we view situations. The third learning concept I wanted to point out that will apply to our change discussion today is that of single loop and double loop learning. So in single loop learning, we know we may have a problem to solve, and we typically, when we need to solve a problem, go straight to finding solutions to that problem. In double loop learning, we don't simply look at improving a system as it exists, but we examine the underlying assumptions of the process. An example of this would be that if we find students are not using a newly renovated lounge that has a pool table in it, we might check to make sure the door is unlocked. We might make sure we advertise that space. But what we might be missing is the underlying belief that the students didn't really want the pool table there, but they wanted a video game system instead. Once that pool table is moved out and the video game system is added, the lounge gets much more use. So sometimes we get stuck in this loop where we're not going back far enough and thinking about what's going on in the situation and how we might challenge our beliefs. So some items to consider. So our mental models, ladder of inference, and the single loop learning may be barriers to change. So how do we make it a habit to question our assumptions and beliefs in order to discover new possibilities? And what techniques work for you to reframe a behavior, action, situation, or change? So with this, we'll jump into some of those models that are related to individual change. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly, but what I want you to think about is how does this apply to you, and maybe consider a change that you want to make and how might that fit into the model. The first model to consider is the trans-theoretical model. This is used in healthcare for people who want to make a change. 6 steps in this are pre-contemplation, the idea that you might not even know you need to make a change, or you haven't even considered that, or you're not aware that a behavior is problematic. In this situation, a supervisor or colleagues might notice something and not say anything, and you're not aware that a change might be needed. For example, there may be a general opinion by others that the way that you ask questions is too direct. This is the way you've asked questions for as long as you remember and you don't perceive a problem. In the contemplation stage, this is when you're beginning to recognize that a behavior is problematic, and you might look at the pros and cons of your continued actions. This might be sparked by a moment of personal awareness or someone saying something to you. In our example, the personal awareness might look like you perceiving that someone reacted oddly to a question you ask. It might also be a colleague or supervisor showing that they think that the way you ask questions is too direct. You may go back to the idea that you've always asked questions this way and you've been fairly successful using this technique. At the same time, if others think it may be an issue, maybe you need to adjust your style. So in the contemplation stage, you develop a list of pros and cons for changing the behavior. Moving into the preparation stage, this is when you intend to take action in the immediate future, and you may start taking small steps towards behavioral change. So in our example, you've reached the point that you realize the adverse impact that your directness may be having on some people. You begin to observe how others ask questions, and you look for advice online on how might I ask questions differently. After that, you begin to take action. So this is when you begin to make specific overt modifications to modify the problem behavior and acquiring new healthy behavior. So you're now experimenting with new behavior by asking questions in a different way. You might try different techniques, engage reactions from others, or ask specific people to give you feedback on how that's going. The next phase is maintenance. This is when you sustain the action. And in the model, they talk about for 6 months, but that could be for any amount of time. So when your change has been going steady and you no longer notice people reacting strangely when you ask questions. In fact, your supervisor might even compliment you on the change. The last phase in this model is termination, and sometimes it's relapse instead, depending on which study you look at. But for termination, it means that you've really incorporated that change into your lifestyle. The old behavior is not how you do things anymore, and you don't really have a danger of relapsing back to what you were doing, so the change is complete. So this is often used in health education as people are thinking about making a change, considering these actions and the steps that people usually go through. Along with those action items, there's the cognitive, emotional, and behavioral changes that occur during these phases too. So this model shows that. Another model considers Lewin's change theory. This is often called unfreeze, movement, and refreezing. So in this, you really need to stop the behaviors that you're doing. You think about, you have an awareness of the idea that something needs to change. this is a time that you motivate yourself by preparing for a change. You build trust and confidence in the fact that you need to make a change, and you actively participate in recognizing the problem and maybe brainstorming solutions with others. It's really a preparation phase. The second phase in this theory is the movement phase. So you will, this is when you're really persuading yourself that the status quo is not beneficial, and you view the change from another lens, and you work to find new relevant information, and you connect with others who support the change, and really start making this happen. And actually make the change happen. And then the hardest part sometimes for people is that refreezing part. So after the change is occurring, what structures can you put in place to reinforce these new patterns of behavior? Or how can you institutionalize this through routine and behavioral cues? Those are three things to consider as you might be working through a change. The intentional change theory is another one to consider, and this one might feel the most practical. This is from Richard Boyces from Case Western Reserve University, and in this he talks through 5 steps of change. The first one is someone considering your ideal self. Who do you want to be? Picturing the future and what that could be if you make a change. And then the second phase is going through who are you now? What are the strengths that you have? And how is this similar to what you want to be? And also identifying those gaps. What is your ideal self, and how is that different from where you're at now? The third part is intentionally creating a learning agenda. So how do you build on those strengths? How do you reduce the gaps while aiming towards your preferred future? The fourth part is experimentation. So how do you start moving in that direction? How do you start getting yourself to change the behaviors that will get you towards that future vision you have? And as you experiment, you find the ones that you like, and then you create new pathways, and you practice that until it becomes routine, like we've seen in the other models. And then in this model, the important part is those relationships with others. What is reinforcing this behavioral change in your environment that really helps you maintain that? Just a couple more, and then we'll move into the next section. So the Fogg behavioral model is interesting because this is B.J. Fogg from Stanford. He has three. He thinks that behavioral change results from three things: it's motivation, ability, and triggers, and these must be present at the same moment for you to perform a behavior. When motivation, ability, and triggers are aligned, you reach a behavioral threshold that will allow you to perform the target behavior. So when people are trying to make a change, oftentimes one of those pieces is not high enough or is not present, and that's what prevents us from changing our behavior. He also breaks those down a little bit more. When you think about motivation, he says humans are motivated by pleasure or pain, hope or fear, social acceptance, or rejection. He also thinks when you think about the ability to do something, that his belief is that humans are inherently lazy. So oftentimes it's time, money, physical effort, brain cycles, which means how much thought you have to put into something. Social deviance, how different is something from the norm, or how different is something from your normal routine. And if those things are in place, those are barriers. So we always want to try to make change simple. And then for triggers, he talks about the 3 different ways that you might put a trigger into something. A spark is maybe an event that happens. Facilitation is when you might intentionally put yourself in a situation where that behavior may occur. Or a signal might be something like an alarm or something that reminds you to do that behavior that you would like. So he talks about when we're thinking about individual change, that it's important for us to be specific, thinking about what is that behavior that we want, what are those, and how do we translate that into target outcomes for goals and behaviors. And he talks about making sure that we're very specific about what this is. Going to a simplicity theory, make it easy. How do we make that behavior that we want to perform easier? How do we get rid of those roadblocks and make sure we do that more often? And then the last part is that triggering for the behavior. What will prompt that behavior for you? Some triggers are natural, others you might design, but when you're thinking about that behavior you want, how do you make sure all these things are in place to do that? The implication of this is if motivation, ability, or a trigger isn't present, that a behavior won't occur. So if it's something you don't want to do, then you make sure one of those pieces isn't in place to perform that behavior. appreciative inquiry is something else that's oftentimes used when you think about organizational change. It can also be used for individuals. So this is from David Cooper Ryder from Case Western Reserve University, and it's a way of thinking about a preferred future in an asset-based model instead of a deficit focus. So the question you often ask in appreciative inquiry is, if this was exactly how I'd want it to be, if our department was exactly if the culture was what I think it should be, or if, as an individual, my behavior was what I wanted it to be, what would it look like? What would it sound like? What would it smell like? What would it taste like? How do you envision what you want it to be? And then at that point, you work towards that. So the definition is kind of thinking through what does that future, the desired future, look like? Go through discovery. What's already working? What are we doing now that is moving us in that direction already, or what's present that we want? Next part is dreaming. So what could it look like? How do we, and then designing, how do we get there? What are those options to make it happen? Delivery is creating an action plan to get there. And again, the positive core is there, because when we're thinking about appreciative inquiry, we're not looking at what do we do wrong that we need to fix, but we're looking at, if things are the way they should be, what would that look like? And then coming up with a plan to get there. So that can also be used when you think about individual change. As I mentioned earlier, many personal coaches create their own model. So let's look at one. This one here, this one shows a model used by one of the coaches. In working towards an individual change, many people find it helpful to engage a coach or a friend or a mentor who's willing to ask the tough questions to help challenge our assumptions, help us reframe our thoughts, and help us move towards the change that we want. So a lot of people will pay good money to get a coach to help through this process and ask those questions. But this really shows what are those coaches doing? How are they working with you? And a lot of it is asking those questions to help you figure out, how are you developing that vision for what you want to be, or that change that you want? How are you challenging your assumptions or removing those barriers, some of them internally, towards making that change? And then refining or reflecting on how we might want to get there, and then taking the action and so that behavior sticks through sustained results. So like I mentioned earlier, you'll see lots of different coaching models. This is one, but when you think about how you might work with someone to help sustain a change, individual change, this is what people might be thinking about. So commonalities, when you think about these different models, what did we learn from this? Obviously, one of those things is awareness must be developed, and this seems very obvious, but sometimes those changes that we might want to do, we don't even recognize that we need those changes or we want those changes. When that moment of awareness occurs, it's sometimes easier than to look back and see what are those pros and cons. So part of the change process is self-exploration. Why do you want to change? Why now? What are the pros and cons of it? What does life look like after the change? And how do you reframe what's happening and challenge those assumptions that you have? There is a lot of self-work in this individual change. How do you affect the change then? What conditions must be present for you to successfully make the change? We talked about motivation, ability, and triggers. Those, what comprises those three things might be really different for you than for somebody else. So what works for you, and how will that work? How will you hold yourself accountable? How do you create those structures and networks for success? And how do you integrate this new behavior into your lifestyle and work to make sure it's sustained? Again, those will be very different for different people. If you look online, if you talk with others about what works for them, it really is an individualized process. You need to figure out what works for you. And we always need to remember that in that maintenance phase, relapse may occur. The good thing with that is, in any of the, if that does happen, you don't have to go back to square one, because you already have the awareness that something needs to change. But how far you go back up a model for that change might be different. But the bottom line is, you will need to figure out, hopefully this information sparks some ideas about what are those motivators for you. How do you picture the future? How do you create structures to get you there? How do you utilize others? And really the most important part is challenging what is now, and how do you view things in order to get towards that future that you want. So I want to move now from the idea of individual change to being an individual on the receiving end of change. So in a change process, change management refers to changes in organizational structure, processes, or procedures. Transition management refers to working with the people going through the change. So this next part is based on William Bridges' book, Managing Transitions. And it's the idea that change is situational. Change is that process, policy, the new boss, new job, and new system. Well, in this part, we're going to talk about transition. And transition is the psychological process that people go through to come to terms with change in a new situation. So change is external and happening to you. Transition is that internal part happening to a person. And some key points to consider are that unless people reorient themselves psychologically to a new situation, a change process won't be successful. And for that reason, when we're looking at organizational change, the people transition management must also occur with organizational change. So people will differ in terms of how fast or how slowly they go through a transition, but everybody goes through these types of things that we'll be talking about. And also we'll be covering the idea that leaders can take actions to help people and themselves move more quickly and effectively through the phases of transition. We'll talk about what those are. Bridges frames there are three big questions for change. So whenever something's happening, people will be asking, what's changing? What will be different because of the change? And who's going to lose what as a result of the change? And that's what some of Bridges' model is based on. Kubler's stages of death and things that people really are thinking through what are they losing in a process. So the Bridges transition model has three parts. It has ending, which is letting go of where we're at now, the neutral zone, which is the in-between zone, and new beginnings, which is when there are new rules and a new identity. This graph shows the relationship of the model to productivity over time. It also shows the typical psychological impact on individuals as they go through changes. So this is pretty common with the dotted line showing a baseline of normal productivity. During the endings phase, people might be in denial, they might be angry. As we go through the neutral zone, we hit a low, and sometimes it's called the ditch of doubt. As you're going through the transition, people might feel apathy, they might be frustrated or confused and listless. And then as the new beginnings are occurring and the change is starting to be implemented, people are more engaged, they're excited, and there's higher energy as people can see where things might go. So let's take a look at the three stages a little bit closer. So when we think about endings, the first phase is endings. So this is, people feel a major issue in the endings phase is a loss of attachment, of influence, of structure, of security, of meaning, of relationships, and of direction. And this requires people to let go, which isn't always easy. People may feel a variety of emotions in the ending phase. There might be shock, denial, anger, bargaining, and sadness. People are asking questions about why. Why us? Why me? Why now? What did we do wrong? Why weren't we told sooner? And is there a hidden agenda? And many people are considering, am I in or am I out? That sounds like Heidi Klum from the Project Runway, but people are thinking through this as, do I want to be a part of this change? Is there room for me in the change? And that shows why people might psychologically not be doing well in this phase. So as you're feeling this, or as your employees are feeling this as you're going through a change, there are things leaders can do to help employees go through this. So the first is acknowledging losses simply and openly. Second is honoring the past. How do you mark these endings and allow people to take a piece of the old with them? Sometimes, the movie Office Space is a good example of this. Sometimes it's those little things that help people. Someone might be moving from one office space to another, but if you let them take that red stapler, that might be enough to help them honor the past and remember that, but move on as they move to the new office space. Selling the problem first versus the solution is another important part. A lot of change models talk about the burning platform. You help people understand that this change is needed. We can't go on the way we are, and why we need to make a change right now. During the endings phase, it's important to expect a variety of reactions and emotions and acknowledge them all as valid. Some people may think they're the only ones going through the situation or that they're the only ones that feel this way, but how do we acknowledge those reactions? And then how do we give people instructions? And oftentimes we need to repeat ourselves during this time. It's really hard for people to understand quickly that they're losing something. They're distracted. We may need to talk a little bit more through things that we have already said. So as we go through, I love 90s music, so this is from closing time, of course. Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end. But in the neutral zone, people may be feeling like this. What is going on? They're stuck between what was and what will be. So when we're in the neutral zone, the second phase of the model, people feel disoriented. They're in limbo. They're in between. There's a lack of clarity and anxiety over the future. They're wondering what's going to happen. You may see less productivity. You may see less motivation, and there may be more sick days taken during this time. Rumors abound. People are searching for facts. Answers might be vague and unsatisfying to them because we don't know what the future is going to look like yet. Recreational complaining is something else that may come up during this time. One of the two good things about the neutral zone, and as a leader, something to think about, is there is potential for innovation at this point. There are no new rules yet. The old way isn't how we're doing things anymore. But during the neutral zone, how can you take advantage of this time? This is a good opportunity to experiment and look through some breakthrough possibilities. So as a manager, when you're going through the neutral zone, how do you help your employees? It's explaining that the neutral zone is what it is, and to validate people's feelings as normal. It is normal to feel like you don't know where you're going, because no one might know at this point. Strengthen intergroup support and two-way communication. How do you have the people that you know in your organization that you trust, how can they help you out knowing to let you know how people are feeling and how people are doing, so you can get that feedback and address the issues that may be coming up. It's important. Transparency is something that's really important to think about. So admit that you don't have the answers, but be optimistic about where you're going and share the information when you can. We need to. We don't know where we're going either. Sometimes when we're leading the change. So, or you're a mid-level manager. So how do you? What level of transparency will you be giving people? And the more that you can, the better it will be. You can involve the employees in creating temporary structures and creating design of the new. So, as much as you can. Give people the opportunity to help give their input or help them sit on this committee to design what is the next phase, what will we look like in the future. It's important during this time too to focus on what you can control and things you can do and be as proactive as you can. And like we mentioned before, consider this an opportunity to innovate. Beginnings are usually scary, endings are usually sad, but it's everything in between that makes it all worth living. So hopefully people can find some solace in the neutral zone and take advantage of that, even though it could be a scary time. So as we move to the next phase, the new beginnings, ready, set, go. So closer look at newer beginnings. When we get to this phase, there's comfort and there's increasing acceptance and commitment to the new vision. There's a positive mood. New focus on the tasks and improved productivity. At this point, we have increased clarity, but there's continued concern about how are you going to be successful in this new environment or this new role. And also people will be thinking about how do I fit in and what do I have to do in order to be successful in this new phase. So things to do as leaders, how do you help people find purpose? How can you help people understand the purpose behind the changes? Let them know why you did this and what it's looking like now. Help people imagine the future and what it will look like to be in it. Plan by outlining the steps in the schedule which people will receive information, training, and support so they know they won't be left behind. And give people a part to play. Help them understand their role and relationship in the new scheme. This might be one-on-one meetings or just helping people understand the bigger picture of where we're at now. So back again to the three questions is what is changing, what will be different because of the change, and who's going to lose what as a change. If we don't consider these options, we're going to have people feel like they're left behind. So this is another vision of how people feel as they go through the process, the three stages, ending, neutral zone, and beginning. It's important to think through how do you address these things. We talked through some techniques to help people manage moving through the process. Couple ending things is when we think about our assumptions, we think about the ladder of inference. How do we let go of our attachment to being right? And that will suddenly open our minds. People think that change is never easy because we fight to hold on, but we also go. And especially in a change process where we both like what we had because it's comfortable, but oftentimes we are excited about what will be coming next. This cartoon says, when asked, would you rather work for change or just complain, 81% of the respondents replied, do I have to pick? This is hard. So as the change model shows, change isn't easy. It's not easy at all, but it's something people always have to go through. And if we can manage it better, we'll help people get through it and come through better on the other side. I wanted to open it up for questions or thoughts. I have some things to think about as you go through transition. I have references here too. I encourage you to dive deeper into some of these models and how they might apply to your situation. But when you're thinking through a change you might be in or in a transition, things to think about is, even as a leader, where are you at with the transition? You're probably going through these same things too, so it's hard to help your team when you're also facing the same issues. What are those areas of the transition you haven't thought about before? What are some techniques you can use for getting over mental roadblocks? What do you need from your leadership team to best go through a transition? How can you share with them what your team needs and advocate for your team? And then how do you take advantage of the opportunity to innovate when you're in a change process? But also, how do you reset your mind to consider new possibilities? If you're changing, it means you may not want to be doing what you were doing in the past. So you really have an opportunity to try something completely new. With that, I'll turn it over to Eric, or we can open it up for questions or discussion.
Okay, Paul, thank you. No questions have been received yet, so we'll leave the question box open for a few more minutes here. If anybody has any questions, please submit them now, and we will send those over to Paul. Otherwise, if we don't hear anything in the next, let's say, 2 minutes, we'll go ahead and wrap up the webinar. So we'll just pause here and allow people to submit questions.
Oh, we got a couple questions here. So are there any specific tips for assisting student employees through big departmental changes? I think this information can apply to any level of employee. A lot of it, I think a couple things can take place if it's possible. One of those is transparency. The more transparent you can be about why you're changing or why you're changing the way that you are, that's important for the students. Oftentimes they're asking questions not to be a pain, but they're really genuinely interested about the thought process behind something that we're doing, especially if it impacts them in a way that they see as negative. I think another thing is any opportunities you have for feedback, any opportunities you can give the students to provide their input, whether through their supervisors or in an open forum or through an advisory board. It's showing that you're listening. And the challenge for that is making sure that they understand that just because you're receiving feedback, it doesn't mean you're going to do what people are asking you to do, but giving people opportunity to give feedback about what might change, how it might change, or input into how the new procedures may look, that's helpful too. Those are some of the things that in literature are the most important parts of that. Another question is, how might we as colleagues going through a change together help get peers on board and moving forward without positional power? This is a tough one too. I think all of these are tough. I think that when you think through the ideas we just talked about is we know that everybody is going through the change and people are having these emotions and having doubt. I think part of it is helping people understand that it's normal. It's normal. Help our peers understand that these feelings might be normal. These questions they have might be normal, and the idea that we can't always influence what might be happening. So how do we help people take advantage of that situation in terms of doing something positive about it. So what do we have control over? How can we make sure our voices are heard in order to help shape that change? Or how can we take advantage of this opportunity to innovate and try something new that we might not have been able to go through before? So I think that forming a support network and acknowledging and validating others' feelings, but also helping people really decide, is this something that you want to be a part of, or is this really something that is so negative in your mind that you don't want to be a part of this? Part of that is helping people make that decision too. If they don't want to be a part of the change, maybe it is time for them to move on and try something else. Another question is, in time of quick responses, how do you think it's best to communicate to staff how long change may take from an organizational lens? This is, I think, another place where transparency might be important. It's not. I think communication plans are something that are big in change management, and the idea of when do you roll out what information to who, and how do you keep that communication ongoing? How much information you share at any given point, and one of the dangers is sharing too much too early when things might still change, but an organization might make that decision to give more information with the idea that things might change. But this is where we're at right now, and making sure people feel included and on board with that. I think part of it might be explaining all the players and everything that needs to happen for the change to take place. I think part of that is explaining both the mechanisms through which the change needs to take place, but also maybe the personalities. How do people work? Maybe it takes them longer to gather information or to think through a process, or maybe it needs to go to the Board of Trustees meeting a month from now. As clear as we can be about communicating to staff about how long a change may take, I think that might be the best approach to help communicate with staff and keep them feeling engaged and on board. And it's, any good go-to phrases for deflecting gossip or venting about changes when it starts to feel uncomfortable? Again, none of this is easy. I think, to me, in this one, I think a lot of it is deflecting it back, helping people think through, why is this change occurring? And the change may be something that we agree with. It may be occurring because of something we don't agree with. It might be because of a state budget situation, or it might be something completely out of our control. So to me, I think when people are gossiping or venting, there's a time and place for that. But then people need to reframe and figure out why are we doing this, figure out what the positives are, how do we make the best of it, and then make sure that we move on from there. In terms of go-to phrases, I don't think I have any in particular, but I think the idea of letting it happen in the right time and place, but then going to the reframing technique of figuring out that you might think this is the bad part of what's happening, but let's look at the good part of that, or working through why it might be better for everybody in the end.
Okay, Paul, that looks like all the questions we've received.
Thank you to everybody for listening today. I hope it sparks some ideas on how you might approach change. Again, at the end, we have a lot of resources for you to consider as you work through change yourself. Eric will post this on the website. If you have any specific questions, I'm much better at answering in writing than going off the top of my head, but I can send you some other resources too. But thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to our audience members. Again, this will be posted online on our website under the resources heading if you'd like to watch it again, see clarification, view the resources, or forward it on to some colleagues who may benefit from this information as well. As always, thanks for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you on our next Blue Kuho webinar. Have a great day, everybody.